Good evening and welcome to Writers on Writing. I'm your host, Dr. Brenda Greene, and we are coming to you from the studio of Medgar Evers College over the airways of 91.5 FM. Writers on Writing comes to you every Sunday and gives you, our listening audience, an opportunity to hear writers from the African diaspora talk about their work, their craft, and their lives. I'm very, very pleased to have on the telephone with me this evening journalist, activist, educator, Herb Boyd. Welcome again to Writers on Writing, Herb.
Thank you, Dr. Greene.
You're welcome, Herb. And this is part 2 of a book that Herb Boyd co-edited with Ilyasah Al-Shabazz, The Diary of Malcolm X, Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, 1964. A very, very riveting story. I say story, riveting personal account of Malcolm X's days when he traveled in Mecca and throughout North Africa. And I just want to just read this little excerpt that Henry Louis Gates wrote about this book. The publication of the Diary of Malcolm X is a great historical event in African American intellectual history. Reading these entries has the effect of overhearing a profound thinker's most private and uncensored thoughts about everything from his split with Elijah Muhammad to the cost of 60 millimeters films in Accra. I found this a riveting and deeply moving experience, one that made me even sadder at the senselessness of his assassination. Every student of Malcolm X and the history of Black political leadership should read this compelling book. And I wanted to share that because I just thought it really epitomizes what I thought about as I read this book and got into the mind of Malcolm X and Hajj Malik. So can you share with us what it was like going through the letters and going through the personal memoir and entries of El-Hajj Malik? And just briefly, just to give our listeners a little bit of background on how you came to write this book again, because this is part 2. I just want to give our listeners who may not have heard part 1 how you came to write this book.
Sure. Well, first of all, in reading that particular quote from Dr. Gates, it perhaps epitomizes, but at the same time, it raises some questions. It raised a question with me when I first encountered the diary. And I had some reservations about that, Brenda, because, you're also, it's kind of an invasion
right.
Of one's privacy, because that diary was something that he was personally keeping, but at the same time, I recognized after going through it that he was not only recording it at the moment, but he also was writing for posterity. I think Malcolm was very much aware of who he was, that he was a very important, a very prominent human figure, and that everything he did was going to be significantly important in terms of the world, global, international affairs, political developments, cultural affairs, all of those things, he was like a key player, and he recognized his role in history. So when he's keeping this diary, he's trying to keep a record of his movement and the people he encountered. And later on, and even in a letter he wrote to his agent at that time, Paul Reynolds, he indicated that possibly one day the diary could stand on its own. Even so, it was pilfered quite a bit, by a number of scholars over the years after it was made available, after that particular collection of his material, that memorabilia, returned after going through a very circuitous route of being auctioned and then reverting back to the family and then turned over to the Schomburg to be kept there for 75 years. And it took about 5 years. Now, going back to 2003, Anna Julia Cooper said it very well. It's so important of when and where you enter. And, of course, when it comes to Malcolm's life, I entered very, very early. But it's not until, 2008 that I really get a chance to read the diary. And even at that time, it was not complete in terms of cataloging and laminating and preserving that stuff and opening it up fully for scholars to come in and look over the letters. Because, see, Malcolm was a pack rat. He kept everything.
Right.
He had receipts, travel documents, every little piece of information about his life. That shows you, again, how important he felt he was. And also to keep kind of a record of everything that occurred. So later on, when he goes back and begin to go through this material, he has a clear indication of where he was, what was happening, how much it cost, as you move from one point to another, the individuals he encountered, what was said. So he has a very solid record, of all those occurrences. He doesn't have to kind of dredge his memory to find out what's happening. It'll all be right there, So,
Right.
so I think he had that kind of concern all along. But I still had some reservations about, looking over somebody's shoulder
Yes.
and digging into their private affairs.
Yes.
And so, but after doing that and seeing the proviso at the Schomburg, is saying that if you're going to use this material, you're going to have to get permission from the family, because the Schomburg didn't have that permission to do so in terms of the intellectual property. It was the state that could make that decision. And since I felt that Ilyasa and Malik, her sister, were the executors of the estate, since I've been covering them in trials and everything, because the sisters had been in and out of court in terms of the revenue and the sharing of that revenue that was coming in on various products connected to their mother and their father's lives. Because you have to understand that both Malcolm and Betty died intestate, that there was no clear wills about what was going to happen with their property, the estate and everything. So a lot of that was done, in a very, very challenging way by the daughters, by putting stuff out there and licensing this and giving permission here and there. In terms of the intellectual property, at last, now that's under jurisdiction, under control by a legacy, an LLC that was created by an attorney representing at least 2 or 3 of the daughters.
Right.
But anyway, the whole situation there is that I cannot go forward with this because, first of all, I've invaded this man's privacy. I wasn't the first to read the diary. 2 or 3 other scholars had already done that and gathered what they wanted out of them, including Dr. Manning Marable, Marika Sherwood, and to some extent a couple of other scholars who had come in who now have recently come out with books mostly about Malcolm's debate at the Oxford Union in December of 1964. But nonetheless, they have bits and pieces from the diary there.
Well, when you said pilfered, is that what you were referring to? You said parts of it had been pilfered. What did you mean by that?
I think that they went in and taken stuff out that they wanted to have. And whether or not they went through any kind of permission to do so,
I see.
I don't think so, because they took, in terms of fair usage, and again, that property was out there and not copyrighted. That's why, that's why I went to Ilyasa. I recognized that if it was going to be copyrighted, then because it's never been published before, right?
Right.
So these are private papers. So if the estate has the control over it, then you have to go and get permission from the estate to use any part of it, unless under the copyright guidelines and the rules and regulation and laws there in terms of fair usage. That's what a lot of those scholars, 2 or 3 of the scholars did. They didn't use that much. They just took a little bit here, a little bit there.
Right. So you really get a distorted view. But the way that you
Not a complete and comprehensive look at the what the content of the diary is all about. No doubt about it.
Right.
But that's what I had in mind. I see. I'm not interested in taking bits and pieces of it. I think what Dr. Gates says, in terms of presenting this to the public. Now, will this in one way you're invading the man's private, in another way you're kind of living up to the kind of desire that he had about this publication, and that's a presumption on my part.
No, I agree. I mean, if you keep a journal, I don't know anyone who keeps a journal this detailed where they're putting, yeah, as you said, putting pieces, information, the flight number, jotting down who they met. I mean, it's really saying I want an ongoing record of this. I'm documenting.
You kind of justify and rationalize it in that way, in that same way, is that I'm not going to interfere. I'm going to present this thing exactly as he said it. But at the same time, as I'm talking to Ilyasa about the project, and she's having some concerns too, but hers was less to do with the invasion of his privacy and maybe the kind of resistance that may occur from her sisters. And she was absolutely prescient and prophetic in that way, because that's what the difficulty we had in getting it out, is because she got some opposition from her sisters who felt, for any number of reasons, that it should not be coming out. Now, however good it was in terms of the annotation and the editing and providing the commentary and putting all of those particular moments and days and context, it didn't mean anything to, or even the commercial value of that didn't mean anything to them. So it gets into like a personal thing among the sisters, which, of course, we needn't go there, because
Right.
then there's a lot of some continual speculation
Right.
in terms of their
Right.
motivations and behavior. But anyway, it ended up in court, and we finally had to go through a year and a half of litigation, and this was very troubling for the publisher, Third World Press, because after Ilyasa agreed to work with me on this and co-editing the diary, and one concern we had is that Malcolm's words would have to exist without any kind of expurgation, no interruption on our part. Whatever he says there, we try to say, this is it. Only if it had some confusion and not clear, or we might add some commentary around that particular moment. But other than that, it's unexpurgated. Boom, it's straight ahead. So one of the things about all of this is that we realize that what publisher is going to handle it? Who could we go to would have the same kind of sensitivity and respect, that we have in terms of the integrity of the project.
Right.
And we figured there's only one person to do it, and that would be Third World Press,
Yes.
in terms of Haki Madhubuti.
Yes.
And because Haki and I had already worked on a book that had come out the year before, and was called By Any Means Necessary, Malcolm X Real, Not Reinvented, which was a response
The real thing, right.
to Manning Marable's book. We felt that there was a number of problems with that book, but more than anything, we would say, hey, let people speak for themselves. And so we rounded up all of these reviews and criticisms, as well as some commissioned essays, and had them voice their feelings about this, pro and con, although it clearly it kind of listed toward the very critical people against Manning Marable, and less so to do with the people who supported him. But we wanted to have some of those voices in there because it given a certain kind of balance. And it was not exactly balanced, but nonetheless, they had a chance to speak. And so people who go to this, the final word on all of that, Manning's book, our response to it, the diary, is left to the reader. We're just writers in one way. We're helping to usher out these particular ideas and thoughts out there without too much interference.
Right.
Let people speak for themselves, and let Malcolm speak for himself. And I think there it is, and gladly it's out of litigation at this point. But understand this too, though, Brenda, as I told you before, is that it's almost like into kind of a limited edition mode now, in that there's only about 2,500 to 3,000 copies left in the warehouse and possibly in different stores. People who got shipments early on before all of the court stuff got involved. I know of 2 bookstores that have copies available because I've autographed them. Barnes & Noble is pretty much, they've sold out. There's only one store, I think, on the east side that may have hard copies. Now, you can go online to both Barnes & Noble and to Amazon.com and you can get the e-version. But a lot of people, they want something tangible. They want
Right.
to hold on to the thing,
Right.
and if they
Especially
can
like
do
a diary, a
find
journal, you want to hold on to that.
I think if they find a copy, you're really, in effect, you're talking about a collector's item at this point.
Right. So just moving forward, can you talk? What was the highlight? What was a highlight for you in as you were reading? What were some of the riveting moments that really caught you as you were reading and editing, I should say, the diary?
Exactly, because both of you and I, we've traveled quite a bit. And even with just going on vacation, it can be pretty arduous, pretty challenging,
Yes.
particularly if you're going into a different cultural environment, a different part of the world. The language is different. The food is different. And here's Malcolm, he's flying literally by the seat of his pants, into different worlds and meeting all of these, important leaders. And so, but he's not doing it with the entourage. He doesn't have a retinue of advisors and people briefing him on this, that, and another and preparing talking points. He's not a Secretary of State. He's
But he's
on his
traveling like that. I mean, he's in terms of the people he's meeting.
Exactly. And so that in itself is a challenge, but then, what hit me, what struck me was the whole human condition, what he was going through in terms of his own preparation and the admission, the very frank admission of certain inadequacies that he had. To what extent, and he's questioning himself. It's self-question, some self-doubt is kicking in. The whole human situation is just like, boom, falling on him. So he's having some second thoughts about it. He's having some concerns about whether he conducted himself in a proper way after meeting a particular individual. Did he greet him properly? After it was all over, when he's in the quiet of his room and kind of recounting that stuff and writing it up in his diary. You have to keep in mind that sometimes he's writing that stuff, what you call it, in real time. He's right there at the
That's right.
table
That's
with
right.
someone while he's jotting down the notes so he can be accurate in terms of what they're saying to him. But then for the most part, though, that happens either before he meets someone or after he has met them.
Right.
That he kind of records and try to recount exactly what occurred there, as most people do. At the end of the day, what happened that day? And that's when he begins to jot it down and maybe a little bit about what's going to happen tomorrow. So it's a combination of a day-to-day diary, moment-to-moment diary, at the same time an appointment book, and documenting his movements. And so what comes home to me is that you see the humanness there. You see the kind of challenges this man is going through. And at the same time, the folks he's meeting and how he's handling himself. You're not talking about someone who has gone through all of these major institutions of education and everything, but someone with the 8th grade education who's come out of a whole penitentiary. But I think in that penitentiary and then later, through the Nation of Islam, he begins to develop himself because he's always on this mission of self-discovery. And I think, being taken away from us in his 39th year, it's a tremendous loss to all of us, to the whole world, because I think he was on a very, very unique plateau, a very different kind of perspective in terms of understanding who he was and how he stood in relationship to world politics. I think that was probably the most revelatory thing, to say nothing of the kind of difficulties he faced traveling in these new cultures. He was constantly afflicted with diarrhea.
Right.
He must have.
His own vulnerability and
Oh,
fearing for his life, having that intuitive sense, living by that sense.
and that was another thing that probably, the psychological challenges and the weight, of his family, what's happening with my family back home, being separated from his friends and loved ones. And at the same time, people over there are all over him. He's moving as an international personality, celebrity. So he can't go anywhere practically, in a very anonymous way. I mean, people calling him out and blah, blah, blah. He's being hit every way. And he has to be very careful what he says and how he says it, where he is, who he's with. So it's a tremendous burden, carrying that kind of weight around and same time realizing that there's a fatwa out on your life,
Right.
that people are talking about taking you out.
That's right.
I
Taking
mean,
your
and
family,
he's already
not only
had these
you.
threats on
Right.
his life long before he travels abroad, and people over there, they knew about it. In
And wanted
fact,
to
you have
protect him.
Prince Faisal say, look here, your life is in danger. You need to stay here in Saudi Arabia or in Ethiopia, where he was invited, in the Sudan, in Khartoum, where you have these people who are major players in the world inviting you to stay there. We give you the conveniences that you need. We give you all the stuff you need in order to develop your ideas, to build that institution, to pursue the scholarship and the political development that you need. But at the same time, Malcolm recognized and said, that's all good, it's all fine, but I got to go back home. I'm a representative of some 22 million black people. They need to know about what's happening here because, see, Malcolm was about the business of unification.
Yes.
He was trying to bring the diaspora together.
Right. He says this is at the beginning, there's one part I just want to read. Our success in America will involve two circles, black nationalism and Islam. It will take black nationalism to make our people conscious of doing for self, and then Islam will provide the spiritual guidance. Black nationalism will link us to Africa, and Islam will link us up spiritually to Africa, Asia, and Arabia. And he's very, very reflective about how developing his philosophy and thinking deeply about the relationships and how between Islam and nationalism. He's still a nationalist, but he's trying to bring that together.
And that was one of the concerns we had in some of the reservations we had about Manning Marable's deductions, his conclusions about Malcolm in terms of his black nationalism. But I think what you're quoting from is part of that mission that he had when he was abroad, not only to bring the U.S. before the World Court and charge it with genocide and the violation of our human rights here, but at the same time to address the African world and to address even the world of the Middle East at that time. But principally, he wants to address the African summit at that time in Cairo. He never had an opportunity to do that, and largely to do with, I think, the kind of shenanigans, the machinations that was going on behind his back that he had no idea, to the extent to which the CIA was involved in all of that.
Right, and one of the things that comes out in this book, there's a man that keeps popping up in the book, and you are led to believe is that who was this person? What was his role? And Malcolm just has him in there.
It's amazing.
Doesn't comment on it, but just
Yeah, one of the questions we raised, Yas and I talked about that. I said, well, possibly, Malcolm near the end got some indication who this guy may have been and began to distance himself from him because he's not mentioned anymore, but he may have been popping up. But Malcolm was keeping his distance. He was seeing from afar. I know in the last two occasions, apparently he saw him walking by. But it was just strange that this one black man, see, Malcolm, even in his autobiography, felt he was under surveillance all the time by the FBI. And then, of course, when he went abroad by the CIA, he was absolutely right about that. All you have to do is read Claiborne Carson's FBI files. You can see the extent to which they was watching every move he made. And then the infiltration of his organization, that was pretty conclusive. When you had at least 5 members of the BOSS, the Bureau of Special Services, NYPD, including Gene Roberts, who later I interviewed, and he told me all about, what was going on with that surveillance. So Malcolm was aware that he was his phone was being tapped, that his letters that was sending out all kinds of bogus information out there as a part of the COINTELPRO. to create all kind of dissension and rivalry, to say nothing about the intense hatred and animosity between various leaders of organizations. All of that was like fulminated by the FBI, and of course the CIA did devilment and mischief abroad.
Right.
This one man, he kept popping up in different places, whether it was in Ethiopia, whether it was in Egypt, whether it was in Kenya and Nairobi.
And we're going to have to stop there. Believe it or not, the time has gone so quickly. But you left us at a really good point, because it's going to make our listeners curious and eager to go out and support this Third World Press. Get the Diary of Malcolm X, El-Hajj El-Malik El-Shabazz, 1964. It has become almost a collector's item. I encourage you to get it. And I want to thank you, Herb Boyd, for talking to us so deeply about this book that you co-edited with Ilyasah Al-Shabazz. And really, we appreciate your work and value you're embodying the legacy of Malcolm X. You are giving and doing the work that is required to make us all very, very conscious and reflective and remember our history and to remember our history. So I thank you for doing that work.
It's beautiful.
Okay. This has been Dr. Brenda Greene. You've been listening to Writers on Writing. I want to thank my host, Fritz Richardson, my producer, Fritz Richardson. And remember, the writer is always reading, the reader is always writing. Keep reading and writing. Empower yourselves as readers and writers, and come back next week.
Song was inspired by a poem written by Langston Hughes. I'm sure most of you have heard of Langston Hughes.